Thank you for your welcome. There's lots of people I know from different walks of my life, so it's good to be able to share it with you this evening. You've got the title there. This is new technology for me, so I hope it doesn't blow up or something, because I've always got a jinx when it comes to this, so I should be shouting for help. Winter 1917. This is a picture of the green as it was. And I'll just point out what little bit remains today, because I'm always babbling on about things I remember, and people say, well, I don't know where it was, or where was such and such a place. So there are a couple of pictures at the beginning, although they're interlaced with events, just to try and put you in the picture literally. I'll try and get my mouse onto here. This and the next section here of this house are now two shops on the green, and all along here where my mouse is running are of course shops. Now this is how I remember it in my childhood, and even, dare I admit it, the cross in its original position. But it looks to me as though the cross has moved really, because when I first remembered it was right on the edge of the road, which of course indicates from my study anyway that the green has been denuded quite a bit by widening of the road. So winter 1917, it's heading for Christmas, and the people of Meriden are looking back on a very grim year. It's affected them all a great deal. I don't say that many people necessarily thought the war would be over by the first Christmas of 1914, which you see in history books, but I don't think either that they believed that it would last at least 3 years, which was something else that had been in the newspapers. But in fact, here they were heading for the fourth Christmas of the war. And the newspapers now were saying things like, well, it might go on very much longer. It could even go on to 1920 or 1921. And it must have been extremely depressing to find yourself in the middle of such a difficult period. I'm going to look back for a few minutes while you look at the picture of Meriden Green about the events that they would have been looking at in the past, the things they'd come through, but only a few of them because of the time factor. I don't think that many people would have felt too upset, though they would have been very sympathetic, that the new vicar had lost his younger son. He'd been murdered far away in North India, and this young man was quite unknown to anybody. But they would have had sympathy, obviously, for the new member of the village, and a very important one, that such a tragedy had happened to him. But undoubtedly, they would all have been affected, some more than others, by the fact that there had been a suicide in the village, which I won't dwell on and I won't give any names to, not appropriate. But somebody had obviously suffered a great deal of depression and anxiety over the events of the war, and they'd taken their own life. And that would have been something that hit such a small village, because what you have to remember is that there's about 850 people in the village when everybody's there. There's about 200 of them are children, and of course they've lost a lot of men overseas, and about 80 men have vanished because either they gave up the time to go off to war themselves, 1915 many of them, or they've been called up because people have been called up, men have been called up the previous year. So those are two things that would have affected them. They kept hearing about people being injured. And I can't show you on this picture, but if I was able to put something more on this side and look on the other side of the green, I could show you the house where a young man who'd volunteered in 1915 had been badly injured. And his family was quite popular, and no doubt his was as well. And they kept hearing bad news about people they knew in neighbouring villages. It was in the paper. Miss Betsy Warmingham, who I mentioned before, who had the paper shop, also on this side of the green, the other side over here, was still trundling an old pram from her shop in Darlaston Row, down the mile, past Patrick's farm, into Hampton, to collect the newspapers from the station every day. I don't know about Sunday, but certainly every weekday and probably Saturdays. And she sometimes roped in one of her nephews, the eldest of whom was 9-year-old Jim. And as the others got a bit older, they were roped in as well, because Miss Betsy lived to 1952 to a great age, but I don't think she was walking to Hampton fetching the papers. But you can see how primitive things were, and I like that story that I was told. So we've got that. And then I think the last bit I'll mention here before we go into the next picture, this is Elm Tree Farm, where I've got my mouse circling it. Over here is Elm Tree Cottage, which is where I lived as a child. But here is Elm Tree Farm, and at this stage it was rented by a Mr. John Nichols. And he had a carrier's cart, though not the one I'm going to show you, but he had a carrier's cart. And he also rented the fields where the sports fields are today. And he was in trouble with the parish council because he kept bringing his horse and cart out of here, which is the entrance to his farm, or the exit, and bringing the lumbering cart and horse across the green. Sorry, the next picture's come up because I've wriggled around with that. And making a pathway in the middle of the green. And it could be very overgrown anyway. I've got pictures saying the grass a mile high. So those are the sort of things that are absorbing the village. Bad news and one or two simple domestic things. It's a very simple community really in that sense. Now this is lower down the village, and again, because people say we don't know where places are, I'll just put you in the picture with this. Over this side here is the Bull's Head, and this is still there. I think it's probably a shop or something still, but that house belonged to, well, yes it did belong to Glover, after whom Glover's Close is named. And he's a real reprobate, and I don't think he ought to be remembered by a road, really. He's not that worthy of being remembered by a road. But here, if I can get my mouse on it, here is the house that was demolished to make the entrance into present Glover's Close. And I'd like you to just have a look at this house. I should be showing it you again and mentioning its significance. I won't say importance, but significance. And then here you've got Nag's Head Cottage, which is still there. And that was a little shop which sold sweets and so on. And you can pick out different places. Brooklyn is here. And this building here is, I think, probably, it must be Darlaston Hall. It's not terribly clear because it's rather small. But you can see the road going on. And here you can see the entrance to Lays Lane. And here, down here, is the pool. So it's a long, narrow village, it still is. But of course it was lined with buildings that were torn down in the 60s, which I think is a shame. So we've got a little bit about that. The Coventry Standard, 30 years after I'm talking about, interviewed two elderly ladies. One of them, at the time of 1918, we're talking about, lived up here because behind this rather splendid building, which was a couple of houses, there was a long line of barns converted. And although she seemed to be quite well off, she was unmarried, and she lived with her mom in one of these tiny cottages up here in this Glover's Yard up here. And I can't show you, we have no pictures. I've got one in my head, but the scientists haven't found out how to produce that onto a film or anything yet. So you have to accept my word for it. She at the time, in 1948, when they're asking questions, was 82. And the leather lady who was being asked was 74 and lived down here, right where we are, just outside in one of the houses on the opposite side of the road, that again has been demolished. And they said, excuse me just quoting to make sure I get it right, but they asked them, what was Meriden like 30 years ago? And the two ladies said, I don't know in tandem, but they both said, it was a quiet village, cut off from the big towns like Birmingham and Coventry. And the villagers travelled, if they wanted to go into town, normally by carrier's carts. So we'll see the carrier's cart. Now, I'm very fortunate in recently having this picture. I've got some lovely pictures, and the best ones often come from descendants. And this was sent me over the internet, so I'm very pleased that it's come out so well. And I want to know really whether anyone, because we've already tried it on somebody on Sunday when we were having the sort of run through to check the sound and so on, whether you can see where it is. Any offers? All quiet, nobody there. Well, I'll tell you, because obviously we've got to get on. It's no longer got all this ivy on the front, which makes it perhaps difficult. But this is the first house in Old Road, and it is Laburnum Cottage, or Laburnum Farm, as it was called then. They sent me more than one picture, but I've only got the chance of putting one in. And this is a carrier's business. So when they're talking about going into town, usually Coventry, because that's a short journey of 6 miles compared with Birmingham's 12, this is what they were travelling in. And I've met people who actually did travel, asked them questions later on, but later than 1948, but not so many years later, that you got into this carriage, and you could also ask the owner. This is the owner, and here's his wife. And I remember this little boy as an elderly or middle-aged man. I got into trouble from him he thought I was disturbing his cows in the field he rented, as if I didn't know how to treat cows, but he was chasing me down the field shouting. When my father told me, I shouldn't say it really, he died of a heart attack, I didn't feel too surprised, because he obviously he was very irascible and very worried about things that he needn't have worried about. But this is an interesting story. I haven't got time to tell you, unfortunately. But this is 2 horses, and here's the carriage. You could sit in the back. You could pay a small fee. Somebody would probably do your shopping for you if you couldn't get into town. That's what I've been told. You could say, you know, will you get me so many reels of cotton or some knitting wool and so on. And the boss, or perhaps even his wife if she went, would collect, and they'd charge you a little bit extra. But it's amazing, isn't it? There was the Midland Red bus, but I have a feeling that, although I haven't found absolute evidence, that probably during the war, because of the shortage of petrol and so on, even in the Great War, everything was in short supply, that people reverted, as in the Second World War, to moving by the horse and cart and so on. So that's worth looking at and thinking about. This year, they faced very poor weather. Again, something to think about. It had a lot of snow just before the beginning of December 1917. They'd had 3 days of snow, and then there was a little bit of a thaw, and then a lot more snow. So they had an early winter, and it was much colder because nobody got central heating or double glazing or anything. Everything's very cold, even for the richest people. But Christmas itself was a green Christmas. We don't know anything much about it, but there was no snow, and it wasn't particularly cold. But during the year, looking back, it had been very difficult for the farmers, because it wasn't just the snow in December, which is a bit early, but it had been a very wet year. And apparently the corn harvest had been blitzed by heavy rain, so that everything had been flattened. And that made for shortages. Apparently, in order to make up the bread, the loaves that people needed, they used potato flour, and that didn't exactly make attractive bread. There were many complaints, and I shall show you one of the bakers eventually. So you had substandard bread, although it was never rationed. You could get it, and people obviously had to make do with sandwiches. There was a shortage of labour as well. Bad weather, shortage of labour, difficulty in getting anything done, even if the weather had been good. And that is, of course, because of conscription the previous year. Many villagers had volunteered to fight in 1915, and several young men had gone, and several young men had been killed. But in the beginning of 1916, there weren't enough people, and so there had to be 2 acts dealing with conscription. And the first was unmarried men, 18 to 41. And then within a couple of months, that wasn't enough either. And so they made it much wider, so that married men would be called up. And even the reserved occupations, and yes, they had them then, were supposed to be farm workers, and teachers, for example, were on reserved occupations. But they couldn't afford to let them all stay at home. And one of the problems certainly was the farm workers. I'll just give you 2 little stories, because one obviously is about the village and one of the men who's killed. The first little vinaigrette, little tiny story, is about Joseph Jeffcott, who lies in our graveyard. He died of wounds on the 6th of May 1918. I think because of his surname, Jeffcott, which is a local name, his background or his father's background must have been somewhere in North Warwickshire, but he himself and his family had come from Birmingham, where he was born, and he came in his middle teens, and he got a job as a farm worker. And I think I can show you the next picture if I remember correctly. Yes, here we are. He got a job as a farm worker at High Ash Farm. I've put this one for you because I don't suppose many of you have seen High Ash, because it's not on a through road, and I'm not sure how private the road might be. I know at times they've had fierce dogs up there, and so it might be a bit dangerous to sort of have a look at High Ash today, I don't know. But you have to go to Lodge Green up the Philongley Road. And when you get to Lodge Green, you turn left, and it's a no-through road, but it hadn't used to be. At the turn of the last century, you could take a horse and cart through it. And I don't know the situation in 1917. You might have been able to then. This is one of Lord Aylesford's properties, because they haven't sold anything in 1917 or 18. But Jeffcott got a job. And then, of course, after conscription came in, he's a young man, he's not married. He is supposed to be in a reserved occupation, but the government had set up tribunals, which some of you may know about from your own ancestry. And if you wanted to ask for either an extension of freedom, not to be in the army, or not to be called up at all, your name had to go before the tribunal. And usually your boss, of course, was supporting you, or your dad if you were a farmer's son. And he was called up to Coventry. And the man he worked for, Mr. Neal at this farm, spoke up for him and said that he hadn't got any other farm workers, and he needed Joseph to carry on working for him. He was only just 18. But of course he got turned down. He was called up, and then he was badly wounded, and he eventually died in the military hospital in Worcestershire. I always feel I know Jeffcott because when I was a young person, I went up to Kinnersey with my mother to see his sister, who was the only other member of the family, apart from her son, who was alive. And I feel that her condition, she'd never got over the death of this very much loved younger brother. And she had been extremely unkind to other people as a consequence. I'll say no more, but the evils of war sometimes carry on for more than one generation. So I always think about Jeffcott and feel that I know him in some sense. They lived in what was then a small cottage, and now is one of the buildings that's been excessively improved. And the other little story is of somebody I met, I suppose about 30 or so years ago. And somebody from the village, long since dead, herself ran me up and said, "Oh, can you come quickly? Can you come today? My cousin's coming to see me. And you'll be really interested to talk to him because he was in the Great War and he can tell you about being called up." So hastening over to here. And I was able to talk to this man who was in his middle 80s by that time, because he must have been called up in the 1916 draft. And he was the only farm worker for a farmer on Slowly Hill in Philongley. And there was an old man running the farm, and everybody else had either volunteered to go or fallen apart in some way or another. And he said, "I can't carry on my farm without this young man. I'm totally dependent upon him." And what interested me was that this meeting, this discussion as to whether he should go or not into the army, took place at our workhouse. And I'll show you that next, because I don't know how many people have seen the workhouse. There was our workhouse. You can't imagine such a huge building could be pulled down, and I've actually been inside it. I'm much more lucky than most people because I've been in all sorts of places in my youth. But anyway, it was at the workhouse, which had a big meeting room on the right-hand side of the front door that you can see there, with a big table and 12 chairs apparently, and that's where they held the tribunals. And they said to the old man, "No, I'm afraid you can't keep your work, and we're much too short of stout, strong young men like this. You will have to use women." You must employ some women. And of course the man was really disgusted because there was a great deal of prejudice about having women back on the farms. You'll see some pictures. I've got lovely pictures of women working in our village here later on in the sequence. But the old man didn't want to have to employ women. But of course, the Women's Land Army, the one from the Great War, had been training women from March of 1917. So there were women available for employment, though most of them, of course, were coming often with very little country background from out of the big cities. Birmingham, for example, in Aldesley, just over the Meriden border, there was a wealthy farmer there who hadn't got many workers, and he allocated 2 cottages, presumably farm workers' cottages normally, and he brought 8 land girls over and said, get on with it, make yourself at home there and do my farm work. And he said that worked very well, because when they'd finished work they got together and cooked their own food and enjoyed their own company, or if they were free they went out somewhere. And they improved in their work, what they were doing and what they were learning. But obviously the farmer on Slowley Hill was a bit taken aback to receive that as the orders of the day. The other thing, of course, that they did have other people to help. They would have German prisoners of war. My own father, who was in his early teens, he told me how the German prisoners of war came to the farm, and he liked them very much, and they made quite a fuss of him, which probably didn't happen much. So he liked the Germans very much, and how kind the prisoners of war had been to him when he was a child of about 13 or 14, and took an interest in him. So there was another group. There were conscientious objectors, though I don't know of any actual groups and any farms here that had either of them, but there were alternatives, I suppose. But I do know quite a bit about the children. Having been a teacher myself during my career, I always imagine these boys particularly only too glad to get out of school. And the law said that they couldn't go under 12 because boys, and indeed girls to a certain extent, had been glad to get out of school, probably at the age of 7 or 8 or 9. But of course this was absolutely forbidden. It had to be much more structured. And you find the rule said nobody under 12. But several of the farms in the village took boys from the school, which was just here, and they employed them at the busy times of year. And I could put it in here, though I'd got it later in the talk, but it fits in quite well, that a lot of them didn't want to go back to school, as you can imagine. And when the farmer said, oh, we haven't quite finished, any chance of you giving me a bit more help with this potato picking or whatever it was? They didn't say, oh no, we've got to go back. And the school board man looking after boys who were truanting, he came and looked at the registers in the school, and oh, what's happened to so-and-so? Oh, they're still working for whoever it was, Mr. Hammond at Walsh Hall Farm, or Mr. Cattell at Patrick's, or Mr. Neild up at the farm we've already seen, High Ash. They haven't come back. So up stumps the school board man and tells off the farmers, of course, ready to fine them. The boys must come back to school because they're only allowed a certain amount of time. Even when I was a young child, people boys particularly, used to be allowed out in October. Sometimes they're called teachers' rest, but what it was boys going to do potato picking and so on in that holiday. And I've done potato picking myself, and even as a small child it's very back aching. I certainly couldn't do it now. So the farmers were having to use all sorts of anything they could get hold of, really. The other great problem, just check what the next picture is if you'll excuse me, yes. One of the problems was that people needed meat. Well, there we've got some cows, but these are milking cows, as you can see if you look carefully. And this is a Meriden picture. I wouldn't give you anything that wasn't. This is a field of Blaze Lane, and it's one of those that's recently been built upon. And there you've got the back or the side of Highgate Cottage, which is still there, which was built in 1838, so it was about 80 years old in this picture. But these pictures were given me or let me have a copy by somebody whose granddad had the cows. He was a cow keeper. Now, it was a problem really to know what to do, because folk needed milk and the cities needed milk, and Meriden was in a good position to send milk to Birmingham and Coventry, particularly Birmingham. And Lord Aylesford had allowed the milk cans to be gathered on the green and then filled with milk and taken down to Hampton Station to go into Birmingham, and that had already been established for a decade before the war began. So they did that. But the trouble was that the people who wanted meat are obviously trying to use the same land, because cows wanting meat. We all know, we're told at the moment, that producing meat is a very expensive business, and it always was. And each cow needs a fair amount of acreage, say 2.5 or 3 acres of land each, and plus extra fodder and so on. And it was very difficult to produce enough food. You see, the German U-boats were trying to keep the food that was being brought from abroad, and there was a blockade. This is what made it so difficult. And that blockade would be felt, even though Meriden is so far inland, the effects of it would be affecting the food chain and the farmers at the time. So I thought you might enjoy seeing the fact that Meriden is very much a farming village. People who don't farm will either be doing housework if they're women, perhaps being employed in a big house or on a daily basis. And because it's wartime, a number of men will have gone into Coventry, because there are factories which are involved with war work in town, and they will probably go on the bus or on a bicycle. But large numbers of people who are left are obviously going to be farmers and some farm workers or smallholders trying to keep things going. So we've already had a look at that. We've seen the cows. The next picture is a house. I wonder if you recognise it. You should recognise this one, I think. Well, they have to look closely because it's much expanded today. This is the manor house, yes. And I've put it in because of the lady who lived here at the time. She's quite important in the development of the village, though she only lived in the village a little while. She's a Canadian by birth. Her name was Alice Drummond, and she's 50 at the time we're talking about, and she's married to a retired banker who I think must have belonged to the Warwickshire Yeomanry, because he's often referred to as Captain Drummond, and he doesn't seem to have been in the war fighting. But of course the Warwickshire Yeomanry was very much in the background of sending men from the Royal Warwickshire Regiment out to fight. There were 30 regiments, no, sorry, not 30 regiments, 30 battalions, let's get my words correct, 30 battalions in the Royal Warwickshire Regiment, and 1/3 were killed during the war. It's a very big death toll. So there'd be people at home trying to recruit and training. Mrs. Drummond is one of the new breed of ladies who are developing a career as well. She's got someone to do the housework. She's probably fed up with twiddling her fingers, and she's interested in all sorts of things. And she's asked to chair a committee, which is quite an important development even for a woman of her educational standard and money at the time. I won't go into a long, dreary diatribe about how the government organised itself, but you have to know a bit. Each county became a sub-area of the government for food production. And each county was divided into sub-areas again, so that the urban and rural districts and the cities and the towns were each a unit. And here was Meriden Rural District, which ended in 1974. And some of you may remember it, as I do. And Meriden was such a large area, such a big rural district, the biggest one in the county. It was too big to administer as one unit. And so in 1914, it had been suggested that the Meriden RDC was divided in half. And Mrs. Alice Drummond has the southern half to be in charge of and to be the chairperson, chairwoman they'd have called her. And Meriden itself, the village, is in that. And so she is trying to organise food to be developed, to grow patterns of growth. In the village we had a horticultural society. it existed from 1915, but being a country place, there was also agri-allotment society and things like that, and a poultry club. These developed during the war, but that wasn't enough to produce the amount of food that was needed and send something into the town. So the government was intervening, and somebody like Mrs. Drummond was in a very influential position because she had to get new ideas going and draw people in, organise things, speak to farmers and so on. And she's the person who, she was interviewed, so I know this is true, and the two old ladies who spoke in 1948 said it in the newspaper as well. She said, "I will organise women's institutes in all the villages in the South Meriden rural district for whom I'm responsible." And the first one, after she said that, was Meriden. And they said, although the Women's Institute, I know, didn't know this until I shocked them last week, I think, that Mrs. Drummond was really the person who founded it, not Mrs. Banks. But Mrs. Drummond went back to Canada quite early in 1919, I don't know why, and then her husband sold up, so perhaps there was some reason, maybe somebody had died that was important there, maybe she inherited property, we don't know the circumstances. Maybe I can find out, but haven't at the moment. And so she passed on her cachet and all the rest of it to Mrs. Banks, who I'll mention later on. But I thought you might like to see her house because that's where she had her meetings. And it was a lovely house. And I'm always sorry, really, that it's part of a huge complex and it's swamped because it was such an elegant house. And the rose bushes were famous in the gardens. And I had the privilege of being inside it once, or perhaps more than once, when I was young. Not as an important person. The vet lived there when I was young. And my dad used to send me for prescriptions from Mr. Knight. Go and get a prescription for various things from Mr. Knight for cows or whatever it was. Let's see what the next picture is I've got. Yes. Now, I think that's probably as much to paint the picture of what's happened in 1917, so we better look at the year in which the war ends, 1918. At the beginning of the year, King George V had sent out a directive, I suppose you might say, because it wasn't, you didn't teach yourself, it was sort of compulsory really, that there should be a special service, and it must have been Epiphany Sunday, because it was the 6th of January, and that looks like Epiphany, it's got to be, that everybody should, in the service at the church, there should be an encouraging statement read out from the king, and that the war dead's names should be read out in every village. So there's very good attendance. This is, of course, St. Lawrence's Church before there's any improvements and before there are any memorials to the dead. I'm sure you can look and see. Up here, of course, this is still there. It's Queen Anne's bounty. So that's nothing to do with war. But here we've still got gas lamps. There was some primitive central heating. There was an organ behind here. And the ancient monuments on each side exist. But it's quite different here. You've still got this here, the lovely lectern, which was made in the village. And I never mention, in case anybody tries to steal it, there's no use me saying we've got a beautiful lectern and then the next day somebody's helped themselves to it, of course. And I'm sure somebody would put two and two together if that happened. But you can recognise, I'm sure many of you have been in, that that is exactly the same. But there are lots of changes here. One or two 19th century memorials are here, but there's nothing to remark about the war dead because it's a year before anything like that happens. So the beginning of year is marked by a special service which brings villagers together if they go to the Anglican church. I don't know whether the same happened in the Methodist church. I do have some Methodist material, but I can't tell you anything about it. It would seem likely to me that if the king sent something to be read at church on a certain Sunday, that the nonconformist churches and the Catholic church too would perhaps read something out. But we only know about the parish church and what happened there. Now, during the end of the previous year, the government was hatching a plot, as it were, something frightening, terrible, that he's never suggested before. In the papers it said there might not be enough food to last, in some papers 3 weeks, in others a bit more optimistic, 6 weeks, but there was not a lot of food in store. And so the government, for the first time ever, decided it must introduce food rationing. And that would affect everybody, of course, in the country, unless you bought something on the black market. And I know I've told the story where my grandfather took his horse and chariot, as it were, out onto Corley Moor and bought some eggs at an extortionate price. Actually, they weren't as extortionate as I thought, because I did manage to check up, and the price in Coventry Market per egg at the time my grandfather got his was 4p halfpenny each. And he paid 6p, but obviously his eggs at 6p each were fresh out of the farmer's barn or wherever, so they wouldn't have been hanging around very long. But that's really very, very pricey indeed. And the cost of living had gone up 50% during the war. Just imagine how difficult that would be to make ends meet. So the government said, right, we've got to have rationing. And they put a minister in charge of a food control policy. And first of all, in January, he decided the one thing that they were short of was sugar, which of course is useful for conserving. And there were lots of problems later in the year, because if there was a glut of fruit, which there happened to be, you needed all the sugar you could lay hands on. And of course, the sugar from the West Indies was difficult to get. And even the sugar from Eastern Europe, of course, was impossible. These sugar beets and so on, because the Germans stopped both lots coming in. So in January, sugar was on ration. And then in the spring, a lot of other commodities. I can't remember them all without looking at my list. I could read out my list if I can find it. Yes, meat, which of course was in demand from people with tough jobs like mining in the north of the county and heavy farm work. Jam, butter, margarine, lard and tea. Not as extensive, I think, as in the last war, but you did have to have a ration book or ration card, and you did have to register with a grocer and a butcher, just as you did in the last war and after. And just as after the Second World War, this rationing went on for some time afterwards, because things don't suddenly settle down. There were problems over this, because there was one letter, the letters in the paper, which are very enlightening and interesting. Somebody said, if I want my butter from one supplier and my margarine from another, how am I going to get my margarine if I have my butter first? Because my butter coupon, which also gives me a right to margarine, has been given to the first grocer. And somebody wrote and said, silly person, you know, you don't register with 2 different people. You have to use the same person. Obviously, we had shops in Meriden, but it would be impossible to feed the whole of the village, even small as it was. Nobody could have that much stuff in. And the village stores, which of course existed and has existed since before Victorian times, was run by a Mr. Allen, whom I remember because he was there when I was a child. I can't remember when he gave up the shop, but probably about 1949. So he was already there. And he was supplying the workhouse. I only found this out from the workhouse papers. And he went into the workhouse to one of the meetings which they had very regularly in the workhouse that I've shown you, in that big discussion room, and said what he could do for it was largely old people now, it's rather like an old people's home, but very poor, or tramps and so on came in, and how he would manage to supply them and guarantee that the workhouse was provided. But many of the villagers, it wasn't any use them going because he hadn't got enough. Now, Birmingham was extremely mean at this time because it's quite a long way to the Birmingham boundary from here, which was Yardley, of course, further away than it is now because it was all country in villages like Sheldon. It was just like round here it is now. You can't imagine it, can you? But Birmingham closed its boundaries to anybody trying to come in from the Meriden rural district. And they could tell, of course, because your ration card's got your name and your address. So Birmingham put a block. No shop in Birmingham would allow a Meriden person to go into Birmingham and register for these goods. And there was a lot of debate about where you might go if you lived in Meriden. And Coventry said, come to us, or was kind anyway, and agreed that Meriden people and villagers, other villagers as well, could go into Coventry and register there. So they had to register with a butcher and with a grocer, and the grocer or the butcher was supposed to deal very fairly with people. I doubt they did completely, because there was a lot of black market. I know there was in the Great War, because I learnt that from my own family. My mother told me there's a lot of black market if you could afford to buy. The eggs were not the only thing her father used to bring in, because he could afford to buy something and pay a ridiculous price probably for it. But if you hadn't got a lot of money, you were in difficulties. But the shopkeepers, they were supposed to have a fair and equitable amount for each person. There was a lot of responsibility for the shopkeepers, because it had all been very ad hoc, I suppose, before, and now they're really restricted in what they can do and have to do, and it makes things extremely difficult. So that's the food situation in 1918, and it gets worse. And indeed 1918, if anything, is going to be a worse year than 1917, and I'm sure people thought it can't get any worse, can it? But undoubtedly it did. So I'd like to go on to something I think many of you will know about, because there have been programs on the television recently. And this is about the Spanish flu. Now, the Spanish flu, of course, was a pandemic, a world problem. But people didn't know that, because there was a lot of limitation on what news was actually put into the newspapers. There was a lot of censorship. The government didn't want people knowing everything, because they would be too depressed, and so they didn't know unless they were very clever or had got some sort of scam going to know where their sons were actually out on the continent. They couldn't know where people were, because it wasn't actually in the papers. And nobody really knew what it was like to be on the Western Front unless people came back and told them. So it was very difficult for people to imagine the circumstances in which their sons and husbands and friends were actually trying to fight. And it must have been the same, I'm sure, on the opposing side. I don't think that we got a prerogative of that. I think that newspapers in Germany wouldn't let things out either. So we didn't know a lot about the Spanish flu, and we don't really know even now conclusively why it was called the Spanish flu. A popular idea that you may have heard anyway is that it was because Spain wasn't in the war and they hadn't got a limitation on their news, and that the Spanish were telling people about this, and so people thought that's where it had begun. But nobody really knows where it began. There's a lot of things about it that are not known despite investigations. But it was a type of flu that was worse than anything probably since the Black Death. With a big Black Death, of course. The last one that we had was 1665, but the really bad one, of course, was the middle of the 14th century, which had spread over the whole of the world, known world at the time. So it was of that type extent. And it seemed like an autoimmune disease, because the most healthy people tended to be the ones who caught it, although not everybody by any means who got it died, but there was a huge death rate. I think it's about 200,000 people in England and Wales. It's suggested that that actually wasn't a big enough number. And certainly in this area, Coventry and Warwickshire, not Birmingham, there were almost 2,000 deaths reported over the time I'm speaking about, which is very high. I wondered about Meriden, because it's almost impossible to find out, although there are one or two historians who've worked on it, and I've heard some interesting lectures, but they haven't covered everywhere. I remember looking in a graveyard just a bit north of here and seeing a grave to a farmer's wife and her child who died of it in 1918. So you might get some occasional influence, but there's nothing in our graveyard that says anything about it. But I was able to see, was at one stage I was chairman of governors of the junior school, and I had a look at the logbook at the time, and I made some notes about the Spanish flu, thinking it might be useful. So I'm going to have a look at what I've got here out of that book and pick out some important things. So this is the logbook for Meriden School. In the background, we know that there were 3 times when the flu took off. One was the spring of 1918, going through to the early summer. There was October and November of 1918. And there was the spring of 1919. And because it's law to keep a logbook in a school, it still is, the headmaster or whoever was in charge, and I must say something about that in a minute, had to keep a logbook, and the most important things about attendance were always kept there. And so we can work out when there were bad problems in Meriden during that summer. The headmaster wasn't there most of the time because he'd been called up. He'd been called up by mistake, and he got back home. He said, you know, it was a mistake. I've just put that one on. I meant to put it on before, just to show you what it's like when it really snows in Meriden when there's no traffic. This is a picture I meant to put on a bit before, while I was talking earlier and saying the weather was bad. At the beginning of January 1980, and I'll go back to the flu in a minute, there was 9 inches on the 16th of January. The next thing after the service in the church that we read about is 9 inches of snow one night and another inch the next day, and all the roads are blocked. Even places like Kenilworth you couldn't get in, and there were cars in places like Kenilworth, and you'd never have got up Meriden Hill. And that's opposite here. This is Fern Cottage here, which is right opposite. And there is where Joan and Jerry now live. But of course, this is all being pulled down. And this had a different name at the time. Oh, sorry, that's the school picture, the next one. That one was known as the Vine Cottage. And that's where one of the ladies who was interviewed in 1948 lived 30 years previously. I think she was living in a council house by 1948, because that's something that came when cottages were either pulled down or given over to somebody else. But this is the school, and of course you'll recognise it because it isn't so very different now. And this is of course where the logbook was kept and where we know which individual children, I suppose, went away if we've got an attendance register. I haven't seen one, but it does say when the school was closed in this book, and that the headmaster had a temporary head because the headmaster was called up, although he was supposed to be in a reserved occupation, by accident, it said. And he managed to get out, and then he's called up again. And of course, you wouldn't dare ignore it, even if it is an error, because he'd be really in trouble. And it wouldn't be setting a good example if the head teacher is ignoring what the law says. So off he went again, and he was away for several months that time. I met his daughter several times in old age, and she reminisced about her father not being at school in the last year of the war. She was at the school as a young girl of 12 or 13. But here's the school, not looking very different, but a lovely garden. It was renowned for its gardens. And the logbook indicates, I've got the dates here, that the school was closed for 10 days during the summer, officially by the health authorities. There were so many children away, many of them with the flu, although we've no evidence that anybody died as a consequence. It would have been in the book, I'm pretty sure, and that they were looking after their families as well. And then it goes on to say that this happened a second time. It's November, end of October, the beginning of November, the 4th to the 25th of November. The school was closed again because children were suffering from this more severe bout of flu. It was really in the village. And again, it's the health authorities, the school health authorities, so nobody away. There's no lessons being taught, just closed down for that time. But it then says something very sad, because when the school reopens, it says that one of the teachers had died. And that's the only person that I can find in the village who died as a result of the flu. It said that she taught the 7 and 8-year-old class. As far as I can see, she hadn't been a teacher in the village too long, possibly no more than 3 years. and it says there that Mrs. Louisa Higton had died of the flu. And I checked on my card index of the burials at St. Lawrence's Church and found that her funeral, her burial, was on the 26th of November, which is when the children were starting to come back to school. So that was pretty awful. And my own grandfather, my dad's father, died of the Spanish flu. So it's always been something that, interest is the wrong word, but it's something that had been within my own family, and an unpleasant experience for those who were left as well, for my father, for my grandmother, for the two little sisters and so on, to have lost their father in an era, of course, when there wasn't any help for people who died unexpectedly. I thought you might like to look at the headmaster. I haven't got pictures of that many people, but I have got a number of Mr. John Penn Rice, who came to Meriden in 1903 as a man in his 20s, but he got the headship of the school because he had been to college and was a certificated teacher, which most people were not, and that took him out of the general run of people, and he got the headship, and he remained here until 1938, and he lived a long time after that, and he came back to a reunion here in this room. I've got a picture, although I didn't attend because I was never a pupil at his school, but a lot of villagers did. I think it's 1965. He lived well into his 80s. So there he is. And I gradually get pictures of him looking older and older and older until you can't recognise him. But I've got a number of pictures that were given me of school children, and that's one of them. And I've got some of him. His daughter gave me some to copy just before she died, so I've got some others of him in a more personal way with his wife, with his daughter and his little son and so on, and those are quite early in the 20th century. So I thought you might like, and keep him in mind because obviously he might crop up again, and certainly the school does, and we can't go back to the pictures once we've had them because there's still some more to put through. So apart from the fact that people have died of the Spanish flu, and people would have taken a lot of notice, we lost more soldiers in 1915 than any other year of the war. 5 men were killed between April and October from the village because the fighting was very fierce in that year. And this is a picture of Philip West. He and his brothers, all quite handsome, tall men, and people in the audience this evening, friends of mine, one of them is a descendant of his brother, and they've been very kind and let access to these pictures. And that's his tomb. Well, you can see it's one of the war memorials, special war memorials, and it's in the Pas de Calais. He was a professional soldier, really, unmarried, 41, not the eldest of his family, but near the elder of his family. And there's his other brothers who went out and fought as well, one of quite a large family. And his parents had retired, I think, by this time. Certainly they were living in the village, but the Wests were one of the oldest families who go back to the 1500s in this village. And this is really the last generation of that family that lived in the village, because once people had been in the war, they often didn't come back. So I put Philip there because I haven't got a picture of Joseph Jeffcott, for example. I thought we could put him there to represent the war dead of the village, which we had, of course, 13 in the end, and many more in the district. And you've got a picture of his tomb. So this bad news kept coming in all the while about people being injured. There were lots of injuries as well. People prisoners of war. It was a lot of effort to try and collect funds for people who were injured or prisoners of war in the village. Now, I said to you that I could show you some pictures of farming because the farming had to go on, of course, and it was still very difficult. So we've got here on this lovely picture, which is off Philongley Road, near where the bypass is, on the right-hand side. A copy of this picture was given me by an elderly lady who was over 90 I don't think she's alive now because I've not heard for some while. But here, she said, this lady here was her grandmother. And of course you get, oh sorry, let me go back to it because I haven't finished. There we are. Sorry about that. If you look carefully, you can see there are several boys. There's 3 boys in the middle. There's another lady working in the field. They've all got these rather unusual rakes. And several men. I mean, I can see them quite clearly. And I don't know whether you can see on the picture that you're looking at, but when I enlarged it and improved it a bit, I saw there was a guy with a barrel of something, I don't know whether it's cider or beer, and he's passing a glass to one of the men. I don't know whether it's one of the boys, looks as if he might like it, but I don't know whether he wouldn't be giving it to the boys instead of the men or before them. But haymaking, of course, is a very dry job. So I thought you might like to see the farming picture because this is the job of the village. This has to go on, whatever. And there they are. It's another one, not the same group. This is somewhere on the Great Packington Meriden border, bringing in the hay harvest. And again, you can look, you see, there's a lady, I think, leaning up against the hay cart, pushing something on. There's another one on the far right. There's ordinary working men, and there's at least one person who looks he's in charge because he's standing in the boss's position with his hands behind his back. The typical boss's stance. Anybody with their hands behind their back. I always try and stop myself doing it. So I think I used to when I was at work. But they're standing there. And looking at him, it might even be the Earl of Aylesford of the time because there's something about him that reminds me of some of the later Earl stances, but I don't really know. And this was given me a long while ago. The owner of it had died without anybody to have any personal possessions. The person gave it to me, said, would you like his pictures? Because we know you'll take care of them and they'll come back to the village at some stage. And I said, well, yes, I'd love to because we don't want anything to be thrown away. And although this isn't a very clear picture, to me, it's worth its weight in gold. It's a really lovely picture, I think. Now, the other things, of course, that were happening in the village, just 2 little things, was that 2 members of the smart community in the village, Colonel Monckton and his wife, who lived in Meriden House up on the hill, they were the village representatives when the first Bishop of Coventry, since the Reformation, was enthroned. They went to represent the village in November 1918 because the new Diocese of Coventry had been recreated and the boundaries redrawn because we were in Worcester Diocese for about 80 years in this village before that. And the other thing was that Mrs. Banks, who I'll mention shortly, was a philanthropist in the village. And I think with some of the money tonight is going to try and improve her tomb in the village graveyard. I think that was one of the things that the parish council wanted to do. I was told a great deal about Mrs. Banks when I was a child, about how generous she was to everybody. And I think she was a war widow. Her husband was killed in April of 1915, leaving her with 3 very small children. And she threw herself into all sorts of war work. And one thing was to be a VAD, you know, one of these nurses that hasn't got a lot of experience, but plenty of willing. And she didn't open the hall, Meriden Hall, where she lived, because probably the young children wouldn't have been suitable to have a lot of wounded soldiers, particularly as they'd lost their dad. But she went to help at Berkswell Vicarage. Half the vicarage was handed over by the rector of Berkswell, and they had soldiers there. And the Christmas party that she organised, she managed to persuade the archers at the Woodman that they would like her to have the hall left to throw a Christmas party. And she got it without paying a fee, I'm pretty certain. And she put on a party, I think partly for the WI, which was new, and which then she was running by that stage at the end of the year, perhaps, or I'm not sure. But anyway, she was very heavily involved. And she invited the wounded soldiers to go as well. So those are purely villagey things. But of course, at the same time, the armistice, we have to look at that as almost the end of what I need to say. Keep an eye on the time, I've already talked too long. I'm not sure what time we began, but I think you'll give me just a few more minutes. The parish council met regularly then, as it does now. And they had a meeting on the 5th of December, ordinary routine meeting. And I think the next picture is going to stand for the parish councillors. No, it isn't, sorry. I put that in to show Walsh Hall, because a lot of boys were in trouble for outstaying their welcome, not going back to school, because they were helping the farmer at Walsh Hall. And I think that's rather nice, because it's so smart now, of course, and it was really pretty tumbled down by that stage. Sorry, I should have put that in before. I think it must be the next one. Yes, here we are. We've got a person at long last. This is Edward Warmingham. The Warminghams were in the village for a long time. In fact, there is one under another name. But Edward Warmingham came to work as the butler at Meriden Hall in 1879. And when he gave up the job of butler, he became the sub-postmaster. And when he gave up that job in 1898, he opened a shop which his daughter Betsy, the eldest daughter that he had of 2 marriages, ran, it said, until she was in her 80s. And he married again, he was widower, and he had 2 houses in Darlaston Row. I suppose because there was such a lot of them, they needed 2 houses. And maybe it was better if Betsy had one place with her unmarried sisters, and the second wife and a number of small children again were better next door. But many of his family who spoke to me about him were very proud of him, but he was a real difficult bloke, I think. When you read, he's always arguing with people, particularly on the committees. He loved committee work, and he was voted as parish councillor. One day, just before the time we're speaking of, he got into a row with the vice chair. I'm not sure what it was because we aren't told, but it did say that the policeman had to be sent because there was a punch-up and he was the protagonist. He was going to thump the vice chair on the nose, etc. And I imagine probably some bad language. And I think he was cautioned. He was always, whenever he took part in any debate, he's always told to shut up, and he doesn't take any notice. He breaks the rules of protocol. He's on the committee for the workhouse, and I was just reading recently, he wanted to send a congratulation when the Reverend Digby left the village in 1915, beginning of 1916. But instead of just sending the congratulations, he started picking flies out of the previous man and saying he hoped the next one was going to be better, etc., etc. And he's told to shut up I don't know how many times, but he's clever enough to keep slipping it in. And so there he is, and he'll have to stand for all the parish councillors for whom I haven't got a picture. So he's one of 5, there were only 5 parish councillors who were elected, and they're all men, of course, at this point. But during 1918, as again been on the news recently, there was the representation of the People's Act in February of 1918, which gave the vote to women who'd got some property or were married over the age of 30. And women had already started to feel their feet a little bit. I suppose suffragist as well as suffragette movement had helped them. And you can gradually see women putting themselves forward, not unpleasantly, but doing jobs that previously they hadn't done. And we find something similar. Women start to feel a bit more confident. And you'll see that happening in what I'm telling you in a moment. They had the ordinary parish council meeting, and then there was a demand that they have another meeting as soon as possible. It happened the next evening, which happened to be a Friday, because the villagers wanted to do something about war memorials. And apparently the whole of the country was taken up with this idea because the war is over, the armistice has taken place on the 11th of November, and this is the 5th and 6th of December, so 3 weeks later, very quickly, we want to do something to say our thank you to the war dead, for the men who still haven't been demobilised, of course, and they're itching to get home, but many of them are held up for weeks down on the south coast. So they want to do something. So people say, can we have this extra meeting? And the parish council say, yes, all right. And they hold it at the school. So it's important to think of your health centre now, and the picture I've shown you as it was at the time. So they call a meeting for the next evening when everybody's managed to get home from work, not particularly early, I think it's 8 o'clock, because people have got to get back to the village. And a lot of people, a lot of adults turn up. I don't know how many mums could manage to come, because what happens to your children? But there were some women there. And they decided to elect a basic committee of 15 people, which seems a bit big to my idea for the committee. It means you've got a lot of arguments, I think. And also, when they met again in January, they said, and we'll co-opt anybody else we need, probably with an eye to the main chance if somebody was going to put in a bit of money and so on. But we've got the names of people. I'm not going to read you a list of 15, but it is quite interesting when you look to see the range of people, and you get I was going to say a number of women. I put them in hard black so I could pick it up, but I can't see it at the minute. Anyway, there's 5 women on the committee, which is most unusual, and I think it must be women starting to feel their feet, because in the discussions are listed in the newspaper. We don't get them anywhere else. The parish council minutes don't have them, because it wasn't a parish council meeting. And I don't know whether anybody kept any minutes, but there certainly isn't anything for me to see. I haven't managed to find anything at all. But the newspapers, from which I got a lot of my information, told you all the ideas that came out of that discussion. And there's 8 different ideas, without reading them all out. But everybody had got a different idea of what they wanted. For example, some people wanted the old cross on the green done up, and an extra plaque put there, because you could have big meetings on the green and a large number of villagers could get there. They've got nowhere to meet, of course. They haven't got a room in which they can meet. Some people wanted something. Mr. Melly, who'd lost his only son in the war and was a councillor as well already, didn't want a memorial that didn't include everybody. And I thought that was generous of spirit, because he must have been sore of heart, really. All the men, not just the fallen, who've been in the war, all the villagers. And he wasn't even a local man, he didn't come from the village, but he wanted everybody mentioned. But in the end, after a lot of haggling, obviously, because there's 8 different propositions, but in the end they put a vote, and they decided that they wanted a meeting room in which they could put the equivalent of the board that's there. The original one that was there until the replica was made in 2015 was put into the parish room that they did build, but that collapsed under the weight of snow in 1940. And when I first saw it, I thought it was everybody. I was 13, I thought it was everybody had been killed. And I can remember standing there looking at it, feeling terribly upset. And I don't know who it was. It wasn't my own parents or my mother, but whoever I was with was an adult lady. And she said, "Oh no, dear, they're the men who fought. Some of them died, but they're the men who went from the village," which pacified me a bit, because I thought if there's 2 or 3 columns of names, that was a terrible loss to anywhere. And I suppose at 13 you're just starting to take that on board. But anyway, they had these discussions, and they decided that they would really like some meeting room or building, if they could afford it, because everything was held up by whether they'd got enough money or not. It wasn't so easy. And I'll show you what they'd had up till 1914 on the next picture. When I showed you the village street, picture 2, which is a long while ago now, I said I would come back to the building which was on the entrance to what is now Glover's Close. And that is part of the building that stood, and the building next to it that you can see is still there. Glover, of course, as I said, had this shop, and he had a great big notice which said Glover that you couldn't not notice. But this house was known as Sunnyside, and you can see at this stage it's quite smart, because it's got the lady of the house and what looks like a maid standing in the garden with the sort of aprons and crossover straps that maids had at the time. Between at least 1903 and 1914, this was the reading room for the village. Now, if you know Berkswell, their village hall is called the reading room. And these were very popular. Many villages, particularly if there was somebody who could help pay for it, who was in the big house, had a reading room. It's a bit of a national craze. There's another nice reading room in Warmley, in Sutton Coldfield, is still there, put up by the owner of Penn's Hall at the time. And I'm sure if we went around the district, we could find a lot of others. But Meriden is a poor village. It hasn't got the money. And Mrs. Banks and her husband, Captain Banks, who was a professional soldier, which is why, of course, he marches off to war immediately in 1914. He's called up straight away, had been trying to raise money to build a village hall for this village, because that's all they'd got. And when the war began, I don't know why, but this building belonged to the Earl of Aylesford, and it seemed it went back into ordinary occupation as a house. So they hadn't, and anyway, it's very small, as you can see. It was really meant for reading newspapers and books and not much more. So they wanted to put up a hall of some sort. Well, needless to say, they couldn't get the money. They may have voted on it, but they were stumped with the cash. And in the end, Mrs. Banks gave them a piece of land, because she had got land and certainly had got some money, and quite a lot of money towards it. The village did dip its hand in its own pockets and found ways of making money, etc. But Mrs. Banks was obviously behind that. And it was on the site where the present club is, on what's called Berkswell Road now, and I still call Berkswell Lane, of course, just above the pool. And I didn't know that, but I only found one document in the Digby papers which said about it. But the newspapers tell me that in a huge blizzard, which was 7th of February 1940, right across the Midlands, the roof fell in. And it strikes me it couldn't have been a very substantial, strong building, what I call a bit jerry-built, I would suspect, because they hadn't enough money to put something and make a really substantial, good building. But it did have tennis courts around it, and there was even a car park, which strikes me as fairly unusual. But by the late 30s, there were a lot of arguments in the village about, I think, doing it up, or should they have another one. Anyway, they ended up without one until this was put up 1948, which was partly by collecting money in the village. Several £100 was raised. WI raised £100, and other institutions did. And I have the honour of remembering coming here, I think, when it was just opened. See, I'm so old now, I go back to a very distant time when most people can't remember. But we used to have the rural cinema here. But that's another story, of course, because I mustn't overstep myself, and we want to finish the story. The other thing that was important, of course, at the time was the war memorial itself. And it struck me that for a tiny village, and a poor one at that, we had a lot of different memorials, because there are several in the church, including the one that the Reverend Waters, the vicar who'd lost his son, said there must be something in the church, and he stuck out for that, although most people were saying we want it somewhere else. So the church has the 13 war dead, there were 13 in the end, on a plaque there. It's also got another one to an individual officer, Mr. Melly, whom I mentioned, his son, who was a young officer of 28, was killed, and the father got permission to have something special put up as a memorial to him, because obviously he hadn't got a grave. There was no grave for him. And Mrs. Banks spent more money than anybody else on this very sumptuous window, which is a work of art. It was produced by a firm called Cam of Smethwick, which was of international renown at the time. And I wanted to try and find out something about it, but they won't let you have any details unless you go to Smethwick Library and book an appointment and look them up. Tracy Williams, the Solihull archivist, and I thought we would perhaps be able, between us, to get some papers, but oh no, we couldn't, we'd got to go. But I gathered she probably spent about £6,000, and that's a staggering amount. And it was consecrated at the same time as what was always known as the Wayside Cross, which is the big war memorial by the pool. And Mrs. Banks paid for that virtually completely. It's on her grounds. Again, I think it's because the village couldn't afford to pay for anything of that stature and quality. And she said anybody who wanted to contribute, who'd lost their own son or husband or whoever it was or relative, they were more than welcome to put into the fund, but the village was going to have this memorial. And I can't help thinking, looking at it, I wondered whether she'd been on one of these tours that were put on immediately after the fighting ceased. I mean, there were people going out before Christmas 1918 to look at the war scenes. Had she been to France? Because it's got every vision of it, to me, looks like one of these French crosses, wayside crosses, and it was always known as the Wayside Cross. It was consecrated with the material in the church. I don't know whether the window is probably something separate, but with the plaque to the war dead in the church on the 9th of September 1920, when the bishop came to the village. And he preached a sermon. He was supported by the Methodist minister, 2 criers from both churches, and a host of people associated with the war dead and children and so on. And he preached a service about toleration. And he said 400 years ago in the Reformation, people were tearing down crucifixes like this, and how much he disapproved of that attitude, because Christ was the symbol of Christianity, and fancy tearing down a crucifix because it was central to the faith. It's probably a high churchman. Certainly Mrs. Banks was an Anglo-Catholic. Her father paid a lot of money towards a whole group of Anglo-Catholic churches in Birmingham, so it might just have been that as the inspiration, but I'd like to know more about it. So the Moore Memorial was there. And the other thing that was happening was that there was a movement to build houses for people who needed to come home, in the land fit for heroes that the Prime Minister was talking about. And it was suggested that Meriden might have as many as 8 council houses. And it's a new movement, of course. And Meriden put forward for 8, and I think it must be Digby Place. I can't see anywhere else that approximates at all to the description of a new road with some houses on each side, and they were to be 3 bedrooms, a parlour, a kitchen, a 1/4 of an acre garden, which seems a bit bigger than they've got, and a pigsty. But of course I don't think pigsties are allowed in domestic circumstances, so perhaps they've been taken away, I don't know. But I can't think of anywhere else that that could be. And they're also asking for more Midland Red buses, so there's things going on within the village at the very local level. But the other thing, of course, to finish off, we must say something about the Cyclist Memorial. In 1919, a well-known cyclist, well, a tricyclist actually, a man who won races on a tricycle called Mr. Bidlake, who was known to his pals as Biddy, who was 50, so he hadn't fought in the war. He wanted something for the unknown cyclist. And it's before the unknown warrior is discussed and put in Westminster Abbey. So he's got a fairly novel idea. And he wrote in the magazine called The Cyclist, which came out several times a year, about this idea, testing people's feelings about it. And people said, oh yes, that sounds quite a good idea. Now, I didn't know until I was reading a book which I bought second-hand last week, that when the armistice was signed, it was cyclists again who were used to take the news. Now, I knew that they were used at the beginning of the war and during the war for messaging, but apparently in order to take messages up to the front to say you cease fighting at the 11th hour today, the 11th of November, pink dockets were issued to cyclists who were in part of the army. And they had to take them up to the line. So every unit had to have one of these dockets which said, no more fighting. Of course, it didn't work in every case. There were deaths and people still popping guns and so on beyond 11 o'clock. But right up to the end of the war, cyclists were involved. And I think that's an important extra. I've only just seen that for the first time. And it's in somebody's diary that had been published recently saying about it, contemporary diary. So I'm sure it's got to be accurate. Anyway, he tried out the idea and wanted to see what people felt about it. And they said, yes, let's try. So within a very remarkably short time, when you think how long it takes to get things done today, by the next spring, they were already collecting their money, working out it was probably going to be at least £1,000. writing to Lord Aylesford and asking if it could go on the green when they decided it had got to be somewhere central to the country. And I like this, they called it the hub of England, which is reminiscent of their bicycles. So it's got to be in the hub of England, somewhere in the centre. And they discussed other places, and they discussed other monuments as well, fountains and all sorts of things. But they decided on the cenotaph that they wanted. And so they had designs created. Lord Aylesford said, because he owned the green at that stage, yes, but there's a few provisos. I must agree to the design, and it mustn't do anything to diminish the ancient cross. They approached Meriden Rural District and Meriden Parish Council, and they got an affirmative from both of those, again saying, let's have it in a separate location from the ancient cross. So they called it what they called the lower green, and I've never seen that phrase before, but they said the lower green. So they made their plans, they got their money. The Prince of Wales raffled a bicycle, which he had done up. I don't know whether there were two bikes, because somebody told me that about another scheme. So there might have been even more than one bike, but somebody bought the Prince of Wales bicycle when it was done up for a goodly sum, and all the money went into the building of this cenotaph. The task of building it went to a local firm called White, which was at South Yardley, for which I would probably say Hay Mills. I don't know exactly where it was, but obviously down the Coventry Road. And they'd got a number of other such commissions from other places. And I want to show you the war memorial for the village in a minute. I should have put that in really before I get carried away. But this, of course, as you can see, I'm sure, is the bull's head. And amongst the celebrations in the 1919, because there were quite a lot of celebrations, but we haven't got time to go into them really, was a party for all the returning soldiers and their friends, which was put on by the publican Thomas Hall for free. And there's Meriden Hall, where Mrs. Banks lived. Beautiful house, of course. She lent the grounds for the other parties. And I put in Mr. Wrench, who I knew. He died in 1975. He used to play the organ at the parish church. But he came to the village as a music teacher. And this is he in the 1960s in old age. But on the day that they had the peace party in 1919, he spent the whole day at the workhouse, playing for the old people, playing the piano, having constant sing-songs. And he was really recommended for doing that. He was a young man at the time with a wife and a tiny child. So he gave up his own day for the benefit of others. And he was a lovely man. I always remember him saying to us at church, I've got to retire. And there was an "oh" went round the congregation. He said, I can't manage any longer. I can't even get my legs over the seat, the organ, because I've got such awful arthritis. And he died soon after, so he'd really kept in harness. A really nice guy, that. I thought you might like to see him. I don't know how many people would ever have seen him. One or two might have done in this room, I don't know. Here's what I really was aiming to get at, and that's, of course, the Wayside Cross. And what I've said about it being very much pre-Reformation. It does say, of course, I was down there in memory with several other people of the first of the soldiers who died in 1918. We spent some time there in his memory on the day of his death, 100 years later. And a foreigner came up, and we were all looking at it, perhaps with new eyes. And it does, I've just been looking at it, and it does say, of your charity, pray for the souls of. Which is not really like English Protestantism at all, because praying for the souls was something that was forbidden, of course, at the Reformation. But I have read in books where people who were bereaved in the war are desperately clinging on to faith and so on, that there was a movement amongst people to think about being able to pray for their lost loved ones, which does lead automatically for praying for the souls of the dead. But I'm sure you would agree that it is more Catholic than English Protestant. And this is a lovely picture, nice story behind this, belongs to me. But a lady lent it me about 25 years ago, and she said, You can have a copy of it, but it belongs to Auntie, who had lived in Meriden at the time, and she doesn't want to part with it, but you can take a copy. So I took a photocopy as the quickest way, and you could actually see it at the time I had it, the name on the shop, which of course was the farmer's wife. I've mentioned the farmer who was in trouble for taking his horse and cart across the green. It was his wife had a shop here, and you can actually read that sign on the card when I had it, but it's all faded on the picture. And a few years ago I gave a talk in Forlongley, and the same lady came up with a packet of about 6 pictures, and she said, Auntie's died, she was 99, nobody wants the pictures, I thought you might like them. And I said, oh, I'd love them. So I've got some nice late Victorian pictures of a family who lived here once, in Thatch Cottage at that, and this one, which is the people paying their respects after the service. And this is the 21st of May, 1921. And it does say in the newspaper that the women were all in tears and the men were very sober. And you can see on both sides, can't you, the men climbing up and the women coming down. And a lot of people bought a wreath in the shape of a wheel, because of course the cyclists were usually called wheelmen at the time. So there it is, brand new. It's just had its opening ceremony by the Lord Chancellor, Lord Birkenhead. I have spoken to people who were actually there, which the school children with good voices were allowed to come and sing one of the hymns. And I've spoken to somebody who was quite old then, who was, I don't know, 7 or 8, and had taken part, said we walked from the school 6 o'clock in the evening and took part in the service. It must have been very moving. There was a bugler from the Royal Warwickshire Regiment with the Reveille and the last post and so on. So it's quite dramatic. I don't know if I've got them in the other order. Let's see what else comes up, if anything. No, I must have missed one out somehow. See if I can get back. Oh, I don't know what's happened to it. It seemed to vanish. I had another one. Doesn't seem to be there. It's got lost. But there was another one I'd put in. I've got it on my list, which says the unveiling service. And the last one was supposed to be visitors and villagers paying their respects, which is the one that you've just seen. So I don't know what's happened. I told you I wasn't good at technology. Something must have happened. It must have decided it didn't like me any longer, and I don't blame it. So I'm minus a picture there. And a lady who's doing all the good recording is going to be annoyed with me, because unless she's got the picture, might have, but mine seems to have vanished, which I just don't understand. There is a lot more I could have told you. I could have told you, and I've done it before, something about the parties that took place, and they're in the book that we produced for the village, because that was part of my research, was to do the parties that we had in the village. We'd got no evidence of them. I never got any information from anybody about the parties, and I had to get that from the newspapers. But it's amazing what you can put together, and you tend to know some of the people, or you can find out about them. And I found, as you've obviously seen from what I've said, that when I got a bit nearer time, then I began meeting again with people I'd known when I was young. I found it quite sad, really, because of course they're all gone, but I could kick myself for not going and asking them more. And I don't know why I didn't go back more after I'd been to university and come back home. Why didn't I go and interview them again? It needn't have been anything more than I did before. My mother used to say, where have you been? Oh, I've been to Mrs. So-and-so. She'd given me a cup of tea. I've been asking her about when she was a little girl in Edwardian times. And they all had wonderful stories to tell me. And some of them, really oughtn't to be forgotten. They're in here. I must get them out one of these days. Anyway, I've overshot my time by quite a bit. Thank you for your toleration. Thank you.